Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the international edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 8 important articles for a detailed analysis. The first 4 articles are very important for the mains exam and the rest are relevant for the prelims examination. So let's cover these topics comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are liking this initiative, do press the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also share your comments as to what you think regarding our initiatives. Now, before we start the session, we have a couple of important announcements. As part of Conquer Prelims 2024, which is a free crash course to help you prepare for the upcoming prelims exam, we have 2 sessions lined up for today. Hima Bindu ma'am will be taking both the sessions. As part of the static crash course, where we are covering the most important static topics, today Hima Bindu ma'am will be taking the last session for science and technology, and this session will be live at 6 p.m. on the Unacademy app. And later at 7:30 p.m. today, right here on our YouTube channel, we will be starting with science and technology sessions, which will cover the most important current affairs of the last 18 months to help you prepare for the upcoming exam. So you can access these sessions very easily by joining our Telegram channel. Just scan the QR code or search for Unacademy IAS English and join the channel. Right before the session goes live, we will share these links. You just have to click on them to access these classes. And also, before I start, please note that our new batches are starting. The English online classroom program is all set to begin from May 30th. It's a new batch. Similarly, there are batches in English as well, which has just started. And you can make use of a special offer being provided where you can enroll for these programs with a 15-month subscription at a price of just 30,000 rupees. So if you're interested, do call the number that has been provided on the screen. With this, let's begin with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this important column from page number 8. This column is related to international relations and it talks about China's interests in Europe. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping paid a very important visit to 3 European countries. It's in this backdrop that this article has been brought out by The Hindu. It helps us understand China's rising global influence. It helps us understand what are China's interests, economic and strategic interests in the European region, and how this could pose challenges for India. So let's carefully examine this topic in detail because you can anticipate mains question based on this particular topic. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited France, Serbia, and Hungary. Many of you might have read about this in newspapers as well. It was a very big development, given that Xi Jinping was visiting a foreign country after a long time. In the last 5 years, Xi Jinping has not traveled abroad. First because of the COVID-19 pandemic and later because of the complex geopolitical situation triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war. The Chinese president in general had not traveled much to other countries. So for the first time in the last 5 years, the Chinese premier is visiting Europe, and that too he covered 3 countries, France, Serbia and Hungary. Now the countries that were chosen are very interesting and very important as well as far as China is concerned. So let's understand what could be the intention of China in organizing a state visit to these countries. What particular interest does China have in these countries and how will it help China to further step up its influence across the European continent? See, if you look at France, as you all know, it's one of the major powers of Europe, one of the leading powers of Western Europe in particular, and a prominent member of the European Union and also the NATO. So clearly, France appears to be aligned with other Western democracies led by the US. But this is largely a wrong presumption, because amongst all the Western democracies, France is one country which actually stands out. France follows a principle of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, which is quite similar to that of India. Some of you might know that India's foreign policy is also rooted in this fundamental principle, which is the principle of strategic autonomy, which means we follow an independent foreign policy. We don't align with any powers or any clubs. We don't join military alliances, etc. So even though France is a Western democracy largely aligned with the Western democracies, even though it's a member of NATO, it usually follows the principle of strategic autonomy when it comes to its foreign policy. For example, when the entire Western world was criticizing India's nuclear tests in 1998, France was one of the few countries in the world which did not condemn India's nuclear tests. Along with Russia and Israel, France was one of the few countries that too, despite being a Western democracy aligned with the Western powers, which did not criticize India's nuclear tests. So that goes on to show how France viewed its relations with India, how it saw India's relations with France to be independent from that of France's equation with other Western powers. So every now and then, when it comes to core economic and strategic interests, France follows an independent foreign policy. Now, this is where China is interested in. China knows it is facing a lot of resistance from the Western powers. China knows very well that the US is trying to pull all the West European countries towards its side in order to create a counterbalance to China. But France could be one of the leading Western powers which could actually help China strike that balance to pull European region away from the influence of the US and maintain that balanced relationship with China. So that explains why Xi Jinping paid a visit to France, and we are going to discuss what interests, what economic and strategic interests does China have in the country. Next, if you look at Serbia and Hungary, these are standout countries in Europe as far as China is concerned. Serbia is not a member of European Union. It's also not a member of the NATO. So it's neither a NATO member nor a EU member. And quite consistently, Serbia has shown a pro-China inclination. When it comes to its economic and strategic policies, Serbia, which is a Balkan state located in Southeast Europe, has often shown a pro-China inclination, and that allows China to have a foothold in the European continent. Then Hungary is even more interesting. Hungary is a EU member. It's one of the members of European Union. But still, Hungary has often protected Chinese influence and interests, and especially at the European Union. Whenever other countries adopt resolutions against China, criticizing China, Hungary is the only country which protects China during these votes at the European Union. Because China has a lot of leverage over these countries. China has made large investments in these countries. So it's in this context that the visit of the Chinese president becomes very, very important. So let's examine this further. Let's look at the timing of the visit, the actual purpose of the visit. What could this hold for European geopolitics, and how could this impact Indian interests in Europe? If you look at the last few years, the world has been in a state of flux. We have witnessed the COVID-19 pandemic that disrupted the global economy, and China was the source of the pandemic as well. Then we have witnessed multiple conflicts breaking out, major wars in Europe, in West Asia, which is essentially a reference to the Russia-Ukraine war, which has divided Europe as well, plus the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. These global conflicts have indeed pushed global geopolitics into a state of flux. Geopolitics has become very dynamic, very challenging. Global economy has been disrupted, supply chains have been disrupted. Almost every single country in the world has been affected by these events. So China is obviously looking to build resilience to protect its own economic interests. It's trying to diversify, widen its trade and economic interests to ensure that its economy is resilient to these external shocks. Be it a disruptive event like a pandemic, or be it the ongoing wars and conflicts and the existing divide in the current world order. China wants to insulate itself. It wants to protect itself by diversifying its trade partners. China wants access to raw materials, resources. China wants to set up factories around the world. China wants to set up advanced infrastructure, critical infrastructure around the world, and especially with Europe. China has very ambitious plans to connect with Europe. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has very ambitious plans to connect with Europe. And some of these countries are going to play a critical role in helping China establish that physical connectivity. Is that clear? So that naturally explains why China is so focused upon some of the European countries. Not just Eastern European countries, but also a few West European countries. Because China wants to tap the markets in the advanced West European economies. And the gateway for that is through Eastern Europe. So China traditionally is closer to some East European countries like Serbia, Hungary, and it's trying to make a gateway towards Europe, towards Central and Western Europe as well, so that it can tap the markets of advanced Western democracies. This is what will power the next phase of growth, manufacturing growth for China. But China is also facing some serious challenges led by US and other Western powers. If you look at United States and other European Western democracies, such as UK, Germany, and many others, they are clearly aligned with the United States, and they all have suspicion about Chinese interests. There is already a trade war going on between US and China. Since the days of Donald Trump, the US has waged a trade war against China. The US has tried to protect its domestic producers and markets by raising the tariffs against cheaper Chinese imports. There is a general concern amongst many countries regarding excessive Chinese dependency, which could hurt their economies, because China is known to misuse its trade advantage to have or to strike geopolitical advantages. Just like India has a huge trade deficit with China, just like India has a lot of import dependency on China, right? So that creates a worry for India that China could misuse the trade advantage and punish India geopolitically, given the border disputes and security issues that we have with each other. So similarly, US and few West European countries are worried about China's intentions. There is a trade war going on between US and China, and especially in the domains of technology, critical emerging technology, and emerging sectors like electric vehicles. A direct competition has broken out between China and the Western markets. If you look at critical emerging technologies like AI or even 5G and 6G communication, China has already made deep inroads into the sector, and some of the Chinese companies already have a dominating position. Chinese telecom companies like Huawei, ZTE, they've already created not just economic concerns in Western countries, they've also raised security concerns. US, UK and others, they feel that the Chinese state, which is an authoritarian state, could misuse the companies, the private companies it has, which have global dominance, to create security backdoors in the telecom equipment, which could be used to hack into these countries' networks, which could enable China to easily launch cyber espionage and cyber warfare campaigns against Western governments. And there is already evidence available to indicate that China is indeed interested in using the economic advantage to cause security damage or strategic damage to Western powers. So Western powers led by US are very cautious about allowing Chinese companies into certain critical sectors. So one such emerging sector is the EV sector, electric vehicle sector. Many of you would have heard about Chinese companies like BYD, which has already started diversifying its global markets. It's already in competition with giants like Tesla, and it's on its way to establish global dominance in the domain of electric vehicles. So in the coming years, most of the world will be transitioning to EVs in order to reduce the emissions, to decarbonize the economy, right? And China would be a big beneficiary of this transition. Chinese companies like BYD which already have the manufacturing potential and the technology needed, the resources, raw materials needed, they can easily establish the global dominance required and dominate all these markets, including the European markets. So this is something that deeply worries US and other West European countries, and this is where China wants to ensure that its interests are protected. Because US and few European governments, they are not just involved in a trade war with China, but this is a geopolitical war. By increasing tariffs, by creating restrictions, by bringing strict regulations against Chinese investments, against Chinese companies, the Western countries are trying to prevent the entry of Chinese companies into their market. So there's not just a security angle involved here, right? There is a clear geopolitical economic angle involved as well. Even if you look at 5G, 6G networks, US and few European governments have already banned the involvement of Chinese companies in the 5G and 6G sector. Because they don't want Chinese companies to exploit the market. They want to protect their domestic companies. Plus, of course, there is a clear security and strategic angle to it as well. So this pushes China to counter these Western powers and exert its own influence in Europe. Because not every European country is entirely aligned with US and other Western interests. There are few European countries which can help China to exert its own influence, especially in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe. So that is the intention of China. If China pushes into Eastern and Central Europe through its investments, through its offerings, it can easily create a gateway into the Western markets as well, and that would allow China to establish its dominance across Europe and maybe beyond the Atlantic as well. So China is essentially seeking to pull some European countries closer to it and away from the American influence, away from Western influence. So this is the game plan. This is the geopolitical game that you get to witness, where US-China are in direct competition, and one of the battlegrounds is the European continent and the European markets. But of course, the Chinese influence and Chinese image has taken a very big hit in Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, some of you might be wondering, how will Russia's invasion of Ukraine hurt China's image? To understand that, you should look at China's position on the Russia-Ukraine war and also understand the similarities between Russian aggression and Chinese aggression, which we often see in geopolitics. Just like Russia violated international law and violated the sovereignty of Ukraine by attacking the country, China often does the same. Be it in the disputed Himalayan borders between India, China, be it in South China Sea or East China Sea, China conveniently breaks the rules-based order. It does not respect the established international rules, and it displays a similar kind of aggression, including military and diplomatic aggression against other countries. Plus, China has been an all-weather friend for Russia, be it at UN Security Council or any other international organization. China has stood with Russia, protected Russia from Western sanctions. It has bypassed the Western sanctions, continued its trade relations with Russia. Apart from India, China is one of the biggest buyers of Russian oil after the sanctions were imposed on Russian sectors. China also reportedly has supplied weapons and assisted Russian defense industry to sustain its war against Ukraine. So they have a strategic nexus between them, right? And Western powers rightfully look at China and Russia to be part of one axis. So as China has stood with Russia, supported the Russian economy, and in a way extended support to its war in Ukraine, and also since it displays similar aggression like Russia, it has often raised suspicion about China's true intentions. So that is why European countries, which otherwise were getting quite friendly to China, they've all become very wary. They've become suspicious in the last couple of years. Let's say you go back to 2019 or 2018, few years ago, many European countries, they were actually looking to work with China closely. Even Germany, France, UK, Italy, all these countries which traditionally are Western democracies, they all wanted to work with China because they saw the economic advantages, right? They were not pulled by the American narrative. But things have started changing in the last 2 years following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how China has backed Russia in this conflict. Many European countries are alarmed about Russian aggression, which has brought war to their doorsteps. And they fear similar Chinese aggression in other parts of the world. And they also fear Chinese excessive dominance in Europe, which could threaten their own interests. So this could be a roadblock for China. And that is the purpose of Xi Jinping's visit, to correct that image that China has created for itself, to make inroads into Eastern Europe especially, and work with more independent countries like France, so that China can boost its influence in Europe and try to make a way forward towards the West European markets. Because see, in geopolitics, if you dominate the trade relations, if you dominate the economic space, you get to dominate the strategic space as well. Money is always tied to the power that you can exert. That's very true in the context of geopolitics or in the context of security and wars and conflicts as well. Right? The business or the money side of it plays a critical role. And if China gets a hold on the economy of these countries, it can always turn this to a geopolitical, geostrategic advantage. Now, if you look at France, France was very welcoming of this visit, because France looks at China as a key economic partner. China could be a supplier, a provider of essential commodities. It could be a great source of investments. Plus, France and China can collaborate in several key areas of technology, right? So that is what pushes France to view China independently. But at the same time, France is worried. France is concerned as well. It's concerned about China's close ties with Moscow. It's concerned about China's human rights violations in Xinjiang, in Tibet, etc. For example, French President Emmanuel Macron, before welcoming the Chinese premier, he deliberately met the Tibetan leaders as well to send out a message to China that France is not entirely okay with China's alleged human rights violations, its close relations with Russia, and its general aggression that you see in geopolitics. So France is trying to play it safe. It doesn't want to miss out on the opportunity presented by China. At the same time, it doesn't want to face any kind of security threats emanating from China. China is known to spy on most of the Western countries. China is known to even wage cyber espionage, cyber warfare campaigns when necessary, targeting Western governments, and France is one of the targets. So France is mindful of the security threats, the strategic threats, but it wants to do business with China. It wants to be closer to China economically while protecting its security and strategic interests. So France essentially is looking to de-risk from the security threats posed by China while reaping the economic advantages, while reaping the economic benefits. In fact, European Union was also of the same view until few years ago. Even the EU, right, they wanted to de-risk from China, only contain the security threats and strategic threats while maintaining good economic relations. So this would serve the interests of the European powers as well. But following the Russia-Ukraine war and the increasing Chinese aggression as well, plus the competition between the European markets and the Chinese market, and the European producers and Chinese producers, this has triggered concerns for other EU members. As I was mentioning, in the EV and automobile sector, now there is a direct competition between Chinese companies like BYD and European automobile manufacturers. As you know, Europe is again a major producer of automobiles. Many of the big brands are based out of Europe. So these governments would obviously be interested to protect the markets, the interests of their private companies. So they know that they're facing stiff competition from Chinese companies. So that is a concern for them. That remains a cause of worry for them. So this is a very delicate situation, and that is the reason why China wants to correct that image. It wants to get closer to countries like France, which are a little more independent compared to the other EU members. Right? France follows the principle of strategic autonomy, looks after its own interests first before thinking about Western interests. So China wants to exploit that. It wants to pull France as far away from EU and US as possible. So in 2019, there was a very interesting assessment that the EU brought out about China. I think this holds a very big lesson for us, even for India. The EU stated in 2019, see that China is a great friend. It could be a great partner. It can be a partner for cooperation. Obviously, it's a leading power. It's an emerging superpower, right? It can assist many countries. It can bring many advantages. So definitely there is scope for cooperation. But at the same time, the EU had flagged the risks associated with China, that China could be a very serious economic competitor. China could dump its goods on our markets. Chinese companies could drive our domestic companies out of competition. This is something the EU countries were worried about, that China could be a very serious economic competitor that could harm our domestic economy. Plus, there is a systematic rivalry between them, an ideological difference that exists between them. If you look at the political, social and economic systems, European countries, especially Western democracies and China, they are poles apart, correct? China happens to be an authoritarian state, right? A communist state. Whereas most EU members, they are pro-democracy, they are Western capitalist democracies. So fundamentally, they are very different to each other and they happen to be rivals because the two distinct ideologies are rivals to each other. So the EU recognized these unique challenges in 2019. They see China as a partner for cooperation. At the same time, they are wary about Chinese competition and the rivalry that exists between them. After the Russia-Ukraine war, the opinion has changed even further. Many countries like, let's say for example, Italy, then even UK, Germany, they have become more cautious when it comes to dealing with China. Because they obviously see China as an ally of Russia, plus they are concerned about China's actual intention and its aggression. But there are some countries which China can work with to project its influence and make a inroad into the European markets. Now this is where East European countries like Serbia and Hungary play a very important role for China. Because as I told you earlier, these two countries have clearly shown a pro-China tilt. Serbia, it's not part of EU or NATO, and it has built very close ties with China. China has brought a lot of investments into the country. Hungary, even though it's an EU member, it is one country which has moved away from the Western influence and largely, in a way, backed Russia and even China in several instances. There have been many instances where Hungary has voted in favor of Russia at the EU. It has voted in favor of China at the EU. So China has a lot of leverage here in these countries. This is possibly because of its massive investments in these countries. I'm sure all of you are familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative, through which China is creating a global network of infrastructure, from roads to railway lines to pipelines to maritime routes, in order to enhance China's connectivity with global markets from Asia to Africa to Europe. So as part of this ambitious project, China has one important initiative with these two countries, and please make a note of this. This could come as a question, even in your prelims. The Belgrade-Budapest high-speed railway project. It's one of the most ambitious railway projects coming up in Europe, and guess who's funding it? Chinese concessional loans. Chinese companies, Chinese workers are executing this railway project, high-speed railway project, that is going to connect the capitals of Hungary and Serbia, that is Budapest and Belgrade. All right, so this railway line could be a gateway for China, because under the Belt and Road Initiative, China is already linking with Central Asia. It has already extended road, railway network and pipeline network into Central Asia and into Russia as well. So from here, it's going to be very easy for China to extend the network into East Europe. So this will provide China direct connectivity, physical connectivity with East European countries like Serbia and Hungary and others through the Central Asian transport corridor that China has been constructing. And what is interesting to note is that China has a proposal to extend this high-speed railway corridor to connect with the strategic Piraeus port in Greece. The Piraeus port, which opens to the Mediterranean, is a very ancient historic port, and even today it has a lot of strategic and economic significance. And for India, a project like this could be of direct concern, because under the proposed IMEC corridor. The IMEC corridor, which was proposed last year at the G20, which was established between India, US, few European countries and West Asian powers. This ambitious project seeks to connect India with UAE and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Israel, and further with Greece, France, Germany and others. So as part of the proposed IMEC route, the Piraeus port is going to be critical. It's supposed to be a part of the IMEC corridor that involves India, US and others. So a rival Chinese project that is also depending on the Piraeus port opening to the Mediterranean could create challenges. It could pose a number of hurdles for initiatives like the IMEC corridor that could threaten Indian interests. So that is why it's very important to observe and understand China's interests in Europe. What is China doing in Europe? There could be a mains question on these lines. UPSC might ask you, what have been China's recent initiatives in Europe? How China is increasing or making inroads into the European market, and how does it threaten Indian interests? So if China, let's say, were to capture the European market from East Europe to Western Europe, that's obviously an economic threat to India as well, because Europe happens to be one of the largest markets for India. The EU is one of the largest trading partners for India. So India's producers, farmers, exporters heavily depend on the EU market. And if China were to entirely capitalize this, that could be a huge disadvantage for India in the coming decades. China also has a diplomatic initiative with some of the East European and Central European countries called the 17+1. This is another prelims topic for you. 17+1 was an initiative launched in 2012 in Budapest between China and 17 European countries in Eastern Europe. For example, countries like Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia and Slovenia. These 17 countries from Eastern Central Europe, right, they're part of the Eastern Central Europe Economic Community. They formed this alliance with China to focus on economic relations and diplomatic relations between them. Recently, there has been a setback. Countries like Lithuania have quit. Countries like Lithuania, which have issues with China, right? It has quit the initiative. But still, the 17+1 initiative pushed by China, which involves these 17 countries along with China, it's a great opportunity for China to push its economic and strategic influence into the region. So you need to look all of these initiatives through a holistic approach. So you understand what exactly China is trying to do in Europe, how it's trying to push its influence towards Western Europe through the corridors in Eastern Europe. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine war has been the biggest hurdle. It has hurt China's image as well. That is exactly what Xi Jinping is trying to correct. Xi Jinping is reaching out to these European countries, promising more investments, promising greater cooperation, and trying to pull China away from any involvement in the Ukraine conflict. Trying to build those relations with East European and other European countries so that it can further expand its influence and thus counter the American influence as well. So in this entire strategy of China, there lies a concern for India, there lies a challenge for India as well. All these markets in Europe are of great importance for India. From East Europe, from the Balkan, southeastern region of Europe, all the way till Western Europe. All the countries are very crucial for India as well. Right? We have major trade interests, geopolitical interests. Increasing Chinese presence here is of concern for us. But one good thing is that European skepticism of China has been increasing. Many European countries don't trust China anymore. In the last few years, based on China's behavior, its alliance with Russia, many European powers, they have a skeptical view of China. They still want economic cooperation, but they want to protect themselves against Chinese aggression and Chinese security threats. So this could be an opening for countries like India, right? Where we can exploit, where we can offer the same economic advantages, build good trade relations, because ideologically we are very aligned compared to the difference that exists between European democracies and authoritarian China. India is any day on the same page as that of European democracies. So there are plenty of advantages that India can bring to counter the Chinese influence. if not replace China, right? Of course, Chinese investments are on a very different scale, which can not be matched by India. But still, there are opportunities that we can work with. The proposed IMEC corridor itself is of great potential, as it has the complete support of Western democracies as well, like US, France, Germany, etc. There lies an opportunity for India to tap into the European market and, in a way, protect our own interests that exist in Europe while countering the Chinese influence. So that is what we learn from this important article, and there can be a mains question based on this. Now let's look at the next article on page number 9. This article is focused on a recent ruling of the Supreme Court. It's related to the Consumer Protection Act, which is designed to protect the rights of consumers, the interests of consumers. Recently, the Supreme Court passed a landmark judgment. Just a few days ago, the Supreme Court ruled that lawyers, or basically advocates, they are not under the purview of the Consumer Protection Act of 1986. See, Consumer Protection Act was brought out primarily to protect the rights of consumers, the interests of consumers. Be it a product that we are purchasing from the market, a commodity, right, or essentially a good, or be it a service that you are procuring from a service provider. The consumer has a right with regard to the pricing, with regard to the quality, right, with regard to the quality of the product or the quality of the service, the way in which the product is priced. So consumers have a genuine interest here when it comes to quality and pricing of a product or a service, and this essentially is protected through Consumer Protection Act. Let's say, for example, let's say I'm running a tour company, right? And as a tourist agent, if I'm not able to provide satisfactory services, if I'm not able to provide the promised quality, if I'm not able to deliver the service as promised to a customer, to a client, obviously they will have a grievance, they'll have a complaint which needs to be redressed. So they can approach the consumer courts, the consumer grievance redressal commissions that exist under the Consumer Protection Act, and find an easier way other than litigation, other than running to courts, find a much easier route through which companies can be held accountable for the faulty goods and deficient services that they might be providing. So these consumer redressal commissions can levy penalties as well on these service providers and companies and hold them accountable, thus protecting the rights of consumers. Now the question is, under the Consumer Protection Act, the term service will include legal services, educational services, financial services, even medical services as well. All kinds of service delivered by a company, by a service provider to a customer is covered under the Act. Just like every good, every commodity, every product is covered, every service is also covered under the definition of the Act. But however, there has been a long-standing debate that whether should we include legal services, lawyers, and especially medical profession, doctors and medical professionals under the provisions of the Act. Because the kind of service they render is very unique, it's very different. Every case will be subjective, be it for advocates, be it for doctors. Every case they deal with is subjective, and is it justified to hold them entirely accountable for a failed case? This has been a long-standing debate. Now recently the Supreme Court has said that advocates are not covered under the Act. This is a Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court says that advocates cannot be held liable under the Consumer Protection Act. Is that clear? So there is a valid argument for this, because there is no way you can quantify or you can measure the quality of service provided by, let's say, someone like a lawyer or a doctor as well. In this regard, let's see what Consumer Protection Act says with regard to medical profession and whether it applies for doctors. As of now, yes, it applies for doctors. As of now, because of a 1995 Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court itself had held that medical professionals are accountable under Consumer Protection Act. But following this ruling with regard to advocates being excluded from the purview of the Act, the Supreme Court has said there is a need to review the judgment of 1995. This is the context. Is that clear? So until now, medical professionals are accountable under the Consumer Protection Act. in cases of medical negligence or in case of poor service delivery by medical professionals, the doctors and hospitals can be held accountable. They can be penalized under the Consumer Protection Act. Why? Because the Supreme Court itself said in 1995, in a historic case, in the VP Shanta case, that doctors need to be held accountable, they need to be held liable under the Consumer Protection Act because they are delivering a service to a customer. Patient at the end of the day is a client. But now, based on the hearings related to advocates being included under the purview, the Supreme Court said advocates cannot be included given the subjectivity of every case, given the unique service rendered by lawyers. And following this judgment, the Supreme Court has said there is a need to revise or relook the previous 1995 judgment in VP Shanta case, where Supreme Court had said medical professionals are also under the purview of the Act. So this brings up the debate whether doctors, medical professionals, hospitals, should they be part of Consumer Protection Act? Should they be included under the purview? So this is a highly debatable topic. That's why the Hindu carries out an interview with two leading experts and they present both sides of the argument. Now see, for example, on one hand, just like advocates, there is a need for protecting the medical fraternity as well. Because providing healthcare, treating patients, carrying out surgeries, it's not an easy task. No wonder doctors are equated with gods, right? They have the potential to save lives. They render enormous social service in the field of healthcare. So can you really hold doctors liable, accountable in every single case? This is a very valid argument because every case is different, every patient is different, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. So can you really judge and hold doctors and hospitals accountable for, let's say, a discrepancy or let's say a death or an accidental injury which might have happened? Because there are many instances where patients misuse this provision. That is the concern. There have been many instances where patients deliberately file these complaints at consumer redressal commissions because doctors are now liable under the Act, right? They even file legal cases, litigations at the court to register complaints at police stations as well. There have been instances where patients, their families have attacked doctors and hospitals, right? Let's say despite all the medical advice, despite all the best precautions taken, you never know how a human body is going to respond, how a patient is going to react to a certain course of treatment or a line of treatment. Surgeries, again, it's not entirely in the hands of doctors. It might be a success. There could be chances of failure as well. So even though doctors brief the patients, their families, even though they give them all the records, the history of the case, they present the entire evidence showing what's in their hand, what's not in their hand. Still, when things go wrong, there have been many instances, horrific instances, where patients have beaten up doctors. Their family members have attacked hospitals, filed cases against doctors, dragged them through litigations for years together. So looking at those cases, it appears as if that yes, doctors need protection, that we should not bring medical professionals under Consumer Protection Act as well, because unnecessarily it's creating a constraint and it is leading to a situation where doctors become hesitant to treat certain patients, right? So that is one side of the argument. That is just one side of the story. The speakers in this interview, they present another side of the argument as well. For example, patients do have genuine grievances, which usually never gets redressed. There have been many instances of medical negligence by doctors, hospitals. There have been many cases of outright medical negligence, from wrong diagnosis to wrong treatment, to blatant mistakes, to even overpricing, unnecessary tests, conducting unnecessary surgeries, causing more complications just with the intention of making more money. There have been such cases as well. These are two extremes. So on one hand, you have patients beating up doctors, blaming doctors for everything. On the other hand, you have certain doctors, certain hospitals which are basically completely negligent, sometimes even resorting to criminal behavior, right? Committing criminal mistakes while treating patients. So both sides of the stories are very true. You need to acknowledge that. You can't be one-sided, you can't be biased here, right? If you look at it from a neutral viewpoint, both the arguments are very valid. right? Patients do have genuine consumer grievances which needs to be addressed, which means doctors need to be held accountable, hospitals need to be held accountable. That too under the Consumer Protection Act. I'll tell you why Consumer Protection Act is crucial here. I'll come to that point. At the same time, the medical fraternity has a valid point, because this is leading to increased attacks on the doctors. It's leading to false cases, frivolous cases, because sometimes patients, they don't want to pay the money. Easy way out for them is just to file a complaint, drag the case and ensure they don't pay the money for the treatment they have got. But there are certain cases where doctors have shown complete negligence. Or, as I said, there have been cases of criminal mistakes as well, right, which accounts for prosecution under criminal laws of the country. There have been instances where patients have lost their lives due to pure negligence and neglect by doctors and hospitals. So both sides are very true here. So that is where we should carefully examine this issue, whether should we continue including medical professionals under Consumer Protection Act. One of the speakers does not agree with it. One of the speakers says that medical professionals should be kept out of the purview, just like advocates have been kept out of the purview now. Similarly, medical professionals should not be answerable or accountable under the Consumer Protection Act. The argument is again the same, because it's leading to frivolous cases, false complaints. It's impacting the doctors and the medical fraternity and the work that they are doing. The other speaker says, yes, they should be a part of Consumer Protection Act to deal with cases of medical negligence, to deal with such blatant mistakes committed by doctors where patients, families pay the price, not just with money, but with lives as well, or more serious complications than they went for, right? So to deal with such cases, to hold such doctors and hospitals accountable, the speaker says, yes, medical professionals should continue to be a part of the Consumer Protection Act. So it's a divided opinion. But however, both speakers agree that there is a need to find a middle ground. Because see, there are few civil laws and criminal laws as well, under which such cases can be tried. Cases of medical negligence, cases of patients attacking doctors, or doctors committing deliberate mistakes just to make more money, or which leads to serious injuries or death. Such cases which violates few civil and criminal laws, right? The required cases can be filed, litigation can be taken up in the courts. But problem is, this route of litigation is complex. The litigation route, which might involve police investigation, which will involve cases in courts, such cases will drag for years together. It will neither provide justice to the patient, nor will it provide a reprieve to the accused doctors and hospitals. Many times it can become an unnecessary burden, a drag on the healthcare sector. The patients will not get compensation because cases will go on for 10, 12 years, because there is already a huge backlog in the judiciary. Plus, in medical cases, you need expert opinion. So courts can't decide on the cases by themselves. Judges will not have the competence. They'll have to bring in professional medical opinion from experts, which is going to take more time. This drags the litigation, the cases go on forever. So a better alternative is through mitigation, which is available under Consumer Protection Act. Consumer Protection Act is a much easier way of resolving these grievances. Compared to filing civil criminal cases, dragging the court cases and litigations for many years, which hampers both the doctors and their work, and as well as patients never get justice, they never get compensation. Instead, under Consumer Protection Act, there is a middle ground actually. It provides for mediation, it provides for a settlement, where the doctors and hospitals can be held guilty, accountable, penalized, and compensation can be quickly delivered to the victims. So this provides a quicker, faster resolution for those grievances. So both speakers agree that Consumer Protection Act has a lot of opportunity here. Medical professionals should be part of it, but with checks and balances. Or else they are suggesting something else. They are suggesting that instead of keeping medical professionals under Consumer Protection Act, exclude them, just like advocates have been excluded, but establish an independent regulator. Establish an ombudsman-like authority. For example, if you look at insurance sector, right? IRDAI is the regulator for the insurance industry. It acts as an independent regulator, as an ombudsman as well. In different sectors, there are ombudsmen or independent authorities that regulate the whole industry. So similarly, in the medical domain, in the healthcare domain, there is a need for an independent regulator or an ombudsman-like authority. Someone who could decide upon these cases, provide protection for consumers, that is patients, provide compensation for them in time if there is a clear medical negligence or clear medical fault. At the same time, protect the doctors and hospitals from any frivolous cases and complaints. So this is an alternate solution being suggested by the speakers. So they are suggesting that either continue with the existing provision. According to VP Shanta case of 1995, medical professionals are covered under the purview of Consumer Protection Act. So let's continue with that. Let's not exclude medical professionals, because the other litigation route is much more complicated. It's better for both doctors and patients to get the issue resolved as soon as possible, which is possible under Consumer Protection Act, but not possible under civil and criminal laws. So that is one possible suggestion as a middle ground. Or else have an independent regulator, an ombudsman-like authority who can regulate the industry, provide a grievance redressal to the patients while protecting the medical fraternity. So that is the way forward being suggested by the top experts. Next, on page 7, we have another important article related to the World Health Organization and the World Health Assembly, which is the governing body of the WHO. So let's take a look at this article. In a few days, the World Health Assembly Summit is going to be held in Geneva in Switzerland, where the World Health Organization is headquartered. India is currently holding the chair of the World Health Assembly. This makes the topic all the more important. India has been elected a few months ago to be the chair of the World Health Assembly. So India is going to head the summit, and there is a proposal to amend the International Health Regulations, or IHR, of the WHO. At the upcoming World Health Assembly Summit, international health regulations might be amended when it comes to dealing with public emergencies and future pandemics. There is also a proposal for a new pandemic agreement, a global treaty on dealing with future pandemics. So these are very important issues given that we have just made it out of a pandemic. So first, let's understand what exactly is World Health Assembly. The World Health Assembly is the governing body of the WHO. It is the highest decision-making body of the World Health Organization, right? So essentially, it sets the priorities, the policies, the regulations that guides WHO and all the member countries. So this body is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It meets every year. It meets every year in Geneva, and it has 194 members. It has all the UN members and few other states like Liechtenstein, Cook Islands, etc. Is that clear? And currently, India holds the chair at the World Health Assembly. These are some basic facts for your prelims. Now, what is the International Health Regulations of the WHO, and why is it being amended? What are the amendments being proposed? Let's understand this. It's very important. I'm sure many of you remember when COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the WHO faced a lot of criticism. WHO was criticized by several countries, including the US. The then US President Donald Trump was openly critical of WHO. He even alleged that WHO was protecting China. Since the pandemic originated in China and China was largely blamed for the pandemic, especially the way in which it handled the initial outbreak, the way in which China was opaque, how it didn't show any transparency, it didn't report the extent of the crisis to other countries, to WHO. It tried to hide the extent of the crisis, which eventually led SARS coronavirus to breach the barriers of international borders and enter other countries. By the time WHO acted and by the time China started working with WHO, it was already too late. The virus had already spread to multiple countries and we were staring at a global pandemic. We all know the kind of disruption it caused, the millions of lives it has cost, the economic impact, the social impact, etc. So as a result, WHO faced a lot of criticism that it's been ineffective in ensuring that countries oblige with the established regulations. So this is where IHR comes into picture. Under WHO, there is something called International Health Regulations, which is legally binding on every UN member. The 194 members which are party to the World Health Assembly, right, which governs the WHO, it's a legal obligation. It's part of international law. Please write this down. The International Health Regulations are legally binding on all the members of WHO. It essentially stipulates the rights of countries, the obligations of countries. When there is a public health risk or when there is a public health emergency, especially when new pathogens, novel pathogens have broken out, maybe a deadly virus or a bacteria or any kind of other pathogen, which is posing a critical public health risk or emergency of international concern, what measures should be taken? For example, lockdown measures. How will you lock down your borders, your ports, and prevent the pathogen from spreading to other countries, from having a trans-border impact? How will you provide information on time to WHO and other countries so that they can prepare for it, so that they can implement the lockdown and quarantine measures and protect their countries, their population from the deadly health risk that has arisen? So all these obligations, rights are specified under international health regulations. Be it the surveillance that need to be maintained, the epidemiological surveillance to look out for new deadly pathogens, to report the outbreaks to WHO and the member countries transparently, right? To take the required measures to contain the health risk, from quarantine to hygiene and sanitation to development of vaccines, testing, diagnosis. What measures have to be taken? What steps have to be taken? That entire protocol is listed under IHR. So once a public health risk or emergency comes up of international concern, all WHO members are obligated legally under international law to strictly implement the IHR regulations. Now, this is where China is accused of breaching the IHR. This is where China is accused of not following these obligations. This is where WHO is criticized for not enforcing these regulations on China. The problem with WHO is that it can't enforce these regulations. It has no enforcement powers. Is that clear? The regulations are legally binding, but there is no action taken if there is a violation. Like China violated it blatantly. It didn't report the actual extent of the crisis when COVID-19 started in Wuhan. It hid the data from the world, right? It wasn't transparent. So it clearly breached IHR. It violated international law, but WHO could not do anything because it's a toothless organization. It has no powers to enforce or penalize the countries that violate IHR guidelines. So that is the reason why IHR is being amended. So at the upcoming World Health Assembly, IHR is going to be revised for the first time since 2005. The last revision happened in 2005. It was first brought out in the year 1969 by the World Health Assembly under WHO. So under this, the goal is to maximize the collective effort, the global cooperative effort that is needed to fight public health risk of international concern. That is specified. Because countries have to work together, they have to pool their efforts and resources together to fight such deadly global diseases which have a transboundary impact. And also the goal is to minimize the disruption caused to trade, movement, connectivity, etc. Because when an epidemic or a pandemic spreads, lockdowns are a solution, quarantines are a solution. It leads to restriction on all forms of travel. It will affect tourism, it will affect all sectors of the economy, it will affect exports and imports, right? So how can we minimize the economic disruption, the social disruption, while maximizing global collaborative efforts? That is the purpose of IHR. So 196 state parties are obligated under IHR, not just the 194 members. Other than the 194 members, even Liechtenstein and the Holy See, right? Even they are a party to IHR guidelines. It's obligatory on all the 196 state parties which have signed and ratified the international health regulations. So it provides a global legal framework. It defines the rights of countries, the obligations on countries. It defines how can we deal with such cross-border epidemics and pandemics where pathogens are spreading across borders, emerging as a major health emergency across multiple countries. How do we deal with that? Those protocols are specified here. There are safeguards to protect the rights of travelers as well. Because obviously travelers, businessmen, tourists, students, workers who are working in other countries, they will face a big risk when lockdowns come into effect, when travel restrictions come into effect. So their basic rights have to be protected. So there are guidelines for that as well. Then what will be the line of treatment? There should be no discrimination when it comes to treating patients on the lines of nationality or religion or race or ethnicity. Every country should be obligated to provide non-discriminatory treatment. Then they should have an obligation to protect the personal data of the patients. Because during such healthcare emergencies, a lot of healthcare data, personal data is collected by the health authorities and government authorities. So there are provisions concerning personal data protection. There are provisions related to consent. The healthcare authorities can't force the patients. Of course, through law they can do it, but it can't be authoritarian force. They need to obtain informed consent of the patients while quarantining them or while putting them on a certain line of treatment or while administering vaccines to them. Right? So informed consent should be provided as a right to the patients. So all these measures are specified. So it's basically an overarching global legal framework to deal with such health emergencies that have cross-boundary implications. So please note down this point. This essentially is legally binding as part of international law. So now the update is that at the upcoming World Health Assembly, which will be chaired by India, there is a proposed set of amendments to make IHR more stringent, to learn the lessons from COVID-19, incorporate those lessons so that in the future we don't make the same mistakes that we made with COVID-19. If the measures were properly implemented in China, if China had cooperated, if it had followed the regulations, reported the actual numbers, the risk to WHO and other countries, if it had sealed its borders maybe in December 2019 or at least in January 2019, maybe things would have been better. Maybe it would have never turned into a global pandemic. So the whole purpose here is to amend the IHR so that we can deal with future pandemics. There's also a proposal for a new pandemic treaty. Many of you might have wondered, how come we still don't have a global convention or a treaty to deal with pandemics? We don't, right? Even under the UN, there is no such global treaty or convention dealing with pandemics. For the first time after COVID-19, there is a proposal. There is a proposal amongst countries that we should have a pandemic agreement, which obligates all the states what to do, what not to do. So this might also be discussed at the upcoming World Health Assembly, and that is why this summit is going to be very, very important for our exams. Now coming to the next article, the last mains related article on page number 7. The article is focused upon India's interest in Africa. This is very important for your prelims as well. As you all know, Africa is blessed with mineral resources. It's blessed with natural resources. And especially critical and strategic minerals are found in large quantities in Africa. From lithium to cobalt, copper, and even many other precious critical minerals, which have a wide variety of application in the industry, right? They are found in large quantities in many African countries. So in Africa, there is already a competition between the big powers. You have Western powers on one side, led by US and European powers. Then you have China, and then you have India. These are the major competitors when it comes to Africa's critical resources, particularly the critical and strategic minerals. Now, according to a recent study, China already controls 8% of Africa's total resources. Can you imagine the quantum of this? One country, a foreign country, controlling 8% of Africa's natural resources. That is the extent of influence China has already achieved in Africa. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, through its massive investments and loans, it has gained a lot of influence in Africa. See, Africa is a very challenging continent to deal with because in many countries there is no political stability. There are civil wars going on. Terrorism, extremism is very rampant. There is large-scale poverty, very poor developmental indicators. So it's very challenging to deal with African countries, to build friendly relations and to tap the economic advantages of that relationship. Many African countries lack basic necessities forget critical infrastructure like roads, ports, and electricity. They lack basic necessities from food to education to healthcare. So it's quite a challenge for any external power to deal with Africa, because the only way you can leverage the potential here and benefit all the sides mutually is by bringing massive investments. And China has the money to do that. It has the financial strength to bring in large investments, offer these attractive loans, and thus it has made inroads into Africa, from North Africa to West Africa to Southern and Eastern Africa. China has already secured exploration rights, mining rights for many critical strategic minerals. And today, Chinese companies and the Chinese state collectively control 8% of Africa's natural resources. Now, this indeed is of great concern, because this will leave behind countries like India and others. So this is where India is also stepping up its game, its geopolitical game in Africa. We have started working closely with African countries by increasing our diplomatic engagement. Traditionally, we have been closer to Southern African countries and Eastern African countries, because historically, trade routes have connected us, plus civilizational trade linkages exist between India and East Africa and Southern Africa. Then during colonial rule, indentured laborers were transported from India in large numbers. Even today, you find families of Indian descent, Indian origin, across Eastern and Southern Africa. So we traditionally have a lot of influence in Southern and Eastern Africa. But right now, the focus is beyond that. We are focusing on Central Africa, West Africa, North Africa as well. Right? So India's goal here is to secure some critical minerals and build mutually beneficial partnerships. Usually, China's investments, China's relations are one way. It's a one-sided relationship. China wants to put money, lure the governments with money and extract benefits. It doesn't care whether it will benefit the African people or it will benefit the African society. Now, this is where India differs from China. Of course, we are seeking resources as well, just like any other power, but we want this to be mutually beneficial. So we are offering help in poverty eradication, in healthcare. India is quite virtually the backbone of Africa's healthcare system. We supply the cheapest drugs and vaccines that powers Africa's healthcare system. We have made big investments in Africa's education and healthcare. You might have heard about an initiative called the Pan-African E-Network Initiative. It was a proposal by former President APJ Abdul Kalam. When Abdul Kalam was the President of India, he was visiting few African countries as a state guest. He saw the poverty levels, the poor education, poor healthcare standards, and he suggested that India can help these countries. We can leverage the resources of ISRO, the satellite assets of ISRO, and deliver telemedicine, tele-education to African countries. So India worked upon this idea proposed by President Abdul Kalam, and today we have the Pan-African E-Network project, which is connecting multiple African nations, and we are extending free telemedicine, tele-education services to African students and African patients. So India makes such social investments, economic investments. We have major projects going on in Africa. Many Indian companies, from automobiles to agriculture, have made a big impact in Africa. So India is really focused on Africa, and now the priority is critical minerals, strategic minerals. So Indian public sector companies like Kabil, Khanij Bidesh India Limited, recently set up PSU to focus on critical strategic mineral exploration and sourcing from other countries. Right? For example, to transition to EVs, battery technology will be crucial. And the most efficient batteries we have is lithium-ion batteries, lithium-based batteries, which also requires copper and cobalt in large quantities. And unfortunately, we are deficient in all these critical strategic minerals. So Africa can be a great source, and Kabil is striking deals, agreements with African governments and African companies. Many Indian private companies as well, involved in mining, are reaching out into Africa with the backing of the Indian government, striking these deals. So you should know which countries are these. You should know what resources are we looking for. Please make a note of this. We are looking at critical minerals such as copper, cobalt, niobium, graphite, titanium, and lithium. These are certain priority minerals that we seek from African countries. And which are the countries with which we have signed agreements? It includes South Africa, Mozambique, Congo, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Cote d'Ivoire and Zimbabwe. Recently, we struck a deal with the Democratic Republic of Congo. In DRC, even though it's a country destroyed by civil war, there are enormous resources with regard to lithium and other critical minerals. So many countries already have a presence in DRC, and now India is also a competitor. So we are striking such deals with African countries, either government to government deals or through private companies as well. So the goal here is to secure the required copper, cobalt and lithium for the EV industry, which we are planning to scale up in the coming years. So India is giving competition to China in a way, even though China is way ahead of India, right? One concern African countries have here is the predatory loans of China. China is accused of providing these massive loans, which are not viable. The projects themselves are not feasible to begin with. Eventually, those projects will fail, and those poor nations, those underdeveloped countries or developing nations, they won't be able to repay those expensive loans. Even though China says it's a concessional loan, it becomes a huge burden on a poor country. So in many cases, it becomes a case of debt trap diplomacy or debt burden diplomacy, where China leverages the economic advantage it has gained through these predatory loans, pushing them into economic crisis, and then eventually taking over the projects, which gives a strategic geopolitical advantage to China. Right? This is often called China's debt trap diplomacy or debt burden diplomacy. Now, this is where India differs, right? We believe in mutual benefits to both the parties, and this is where India has an edge over China as well. Now, coming to the prelim section, we'll take a quick look at the small articles today. One, there is an article on page number 3 that talks about the presence of microplastics in the aquatic organisms in the Ashtamudi lake. This is a very concerning development. Ashtamudi lake is one of our critical habitats. It's a very important protected area. It's a wetland that has been recognized under the Ramsar Convention. It's a Ramsar site. So it's a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. So you should know where is it located, right? And you should also know what's the risk posed by microplastics. Microplastics are nothing but very minute fragments of plastics in the range of, in the size of nanometers, for example. So these broken down plastic substrates, they're extremely harmful, hazardous, because they can enter the water bodies from lakes, rivers to seas and oceans, and they can easily climb up the food chain. They could be consumed, ingested by marine organisms, starting with fish and other aquatic organisms, and it could climb up the food chain, reaching the higher predators and the higher organisms, including humans as well. So microplastic contamination of the food chain has remained a great environmental concern. Correct? So Ashtamudi Lake is facing a similar risk. A recent study has established very large concentration of microplastics in the fishes and other aquatic organisms found in the Ashtamudi Lake. Now, where is Ashtamudi Lake located? It is in the Kollam district of Kerala. It's a protected wetland, right? It's recognized by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change as a national wetland, and it is a Ramsar site. It's a designated wetland of international importance under Ramsar Convention. Next, on page number 4, we have this article related to Char Dham Yatra. It's actually referring to Chota Char Dham Yatra. According to the article, the Char Dham Yatra, which is in Uttarakhand, the Chota Char Dham in Uttarakhand, it's a very important pilgrimage for Hindu pilgrims. So you should know which 4 pilgrimage sites are part of the Chota Char Dham in Uttarakhand. This includes the 4 historic temples at Badrinath, Kedarnath, Gangotri and Yamunotri. You can see the map as well. It's a pilgrimage route that covers 4 historic important temples in Uttarakhand in the Himalayan ranges. That is Yamunotri, Gangotri, Kedarnath and Badrinath. Located at the foothills of Himalayas, located on the banks of important Himalayan rivers that are part of the Gangetic Basin. So these religious places, these temples are of great cultural and social significance in Hinduism in particular. So this is the Chota Char Dham Yatra. So every year, lakhs of people, millions of people visit these places. This corridor is covered by so many pilgrims and tourists. Many cases, it leads to stampedes. It leads to unnecessary man-made disasters. So to deal with the crowds, to manage the pilgrimage, the central government has urged Uttarakhand, the state of Uttarakhand, to deploy NDRF and ITBP personnel to manage the large crowds. So that is the article, that is the development. The center has urged the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is responsible for disaster management, right? It has urged the state government to make use of National Disaster Response Force and ITBP soldiers from Indo-Tibetan Border Police, because they have expertise in the terrain. So these personnel can be used by the government of Uttarakhand to manage the large swelling crowds, to manage the crowds efficiently, to prevent a stampede. Because you might remember, recently there was a deadly stampede in Uttarakhand that led to large-scale loss of lives. So it's a man-made disaster and it can be prevented with better management, with better planning, with better preparedness. So please note down which are the 4 pilgrimage sites that are part of Chota Char Dham Yatra and what is the relevance of this article. Now, I want to give you a small exercise. It's a small assignment for you. Apart from Chota Char Dham, there is a bigger Char Dham Yatra that covers pilgrimage sites across the country. Can you find out which are the 4 pilgrimage sites that are part of the nationwide Char Dham Yatra? See, Chota Char Dham is specific to Uttarakhand. It's specific to these 4 pilgrimage sites. There is a Char Dham Yatra covering many other states. There are 4 other important pilgrimage sites. Please find out which are these pilgrimage sites and mention those 4 pilgrimage sites in the comments which are part of the Char Dham Yatra. Now coming to another article on page number 4, the article refers to the Department of Military Affairs. Now this could be very important for your prelims because this is a newly set up department under the Ministry of Defence. Recently, just a few years ago, this new department was created. According to the article, the Department of Military Affairs has sought a review of the controversial Agnipath scheme from all the 3 armed forces, from Army, Navy and Air Force. That is the development being reported over here, right? The article itself is not very relevant for us, but there can be a prelims question on the Department of Military Affairs. UPSC might ask you, who heads the DMA? Who is the secretary to this department? What is the role, the mandate of the Department of Military Affairs? Based on this, a prelims question can be given. This newly created department is headed by the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff. In fact, in 2019, when the position of CDS was created, who would be the highest ranking services officer, who would chair the Chief of Staff Committee, right? So the CDS would not only have a military role, would not only function as a military officer, as the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee, right? The Chief of Staff Committee basically brings together the 3 service chiefs, the Army Chief, the Navy Chief and the Air Force Chief. They come together under the Chief of Staff Committee. So now a permanent chairman has been appointed, that is the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff. So CDS performs a military role as the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee, essentially supersiding over the 3 service chiefs. Even though CDS does not have superintendence over the service chiefs have their own independent autonomous powers over the 3 services. The CDS does have a higher authority as a higher ranking officer, can direct the 3 service chiefs to bring jointness, to bring integration amongst the 3 armed forces, to look at joint operational issues, joint procurement issues, to streamline military budget, military preparedness, weapons procurement, right? So the CDS occupies a very critical role in India's national security architecture. So this was not the only role that CDS was meant for, not just the military role. The CDS also holds a bureaucratic role, also acts like a bureaucrat as the secretary to this newly created department, the Department of Military Affairs within the Defence Ministry. So as the secretary to the DMA, The CDS will serve as a single point military advisor. Single point military advisor to the defense minister. Be it procurement, be it operations, military operations, right? The CDS would be a single point military advisor to the defense minister by virtue of being the secretary to this department. And the department is also focused on building jointness, optimizing the defense budget, ensuring there is no overlap between the weapons being procured for Army, Air Force and Navy, right? To essentially optimize the defense budget and ensure that we speed up the procurements, ensure our forces are modernized quickly, and build jointness, integration, and eventually set up joint commands and integrated theater commands. So that is the mandate of the DMA, the Department of Military Affairs, which is headed by the Chief of Defence Staff as the Secretary. Is that clear? Now let's come to the last article for today. On page 15, there's an article referring to the Nairobi-Washington Vision, which has been adopted between the US and Kenya. It's actually related to what we were studying earlier about China's predatory loans and how China pushes small countries into a debt trap. For the first time in 15 years, an African leader is visiting United States. The Kenyan leader is on a state visit to the US. So it was during this summit between the leaders of Kenya and US, the Nairobi-Washington Vision has been adopted. Now, what is the purpose of this vision? The purpose is basically to reduce the debt of developing nations and underdeveloped nations, especially the predatory loans given by countries like China. So there is a geopolitical objective behind it. It appears to be an economic initiative, right? So UPSC might ask you, what's the objective of Nairobi-Washington Vision? Its primary objective is to help poor African countries, underdeveloped, least developed countries, to reduce the debt, to bring down their external foreign debt. Because many countries are going through a debt crisis. They're not able to service the foreign debt because they've borrowed heavily from foreign partners and external organizations. But in Africa, as I was discussing, the concern is about China's massive presence. Through its Belt and Road Initiative and its other investments, it has offered billions of dollars of loans to authoritarian leaders, poor developing and underdeveloped countries in Africa, which today are not in a position to repay the loans. So as I said, the concern is China misuses this economic advantage and it will try to turn this into a geopolitical advantage. So the US is trying to counter China by offering help to countries like Kenya to overcome the debt problem. Now just look at the data. Out of Kenya's overall debt burden, if you look at its debt to GDP ratio, right, it's at a very high number, 70%. But bulk of the debt that Kenya owes to its to its creditors, it is owed to China. China is the biggest lender to Kenya. So today Kenya is facing a debt crisis, a debt burden. Large part of the debt is owed to Chinese banks and Chinese donors. So this essentially is placing Kenya under a burden which China could leverage and exploit. The same is the situation with many other African countries. If you look at Democratic Republic of Congo or Tanzania, Mozambique, Djibouti, many African countries are facing a similar debt problem. Initially, they took attractive loans. It looked very attractive for them, very cheap concessional loans. Later, they realized many projects are commercially failing. Because, to be honest, China was never interested in the commercial aspect of the project. It was looking at the strategic value of many projects, right? So now, China is making a move to take over some of the projects, get them on lease for long term, so that it can add a strategic geopolitical angle to those projects. So this vision document, the Kenya or Nairobi-Washington Vision document, it provides hope for these African countries to overcome the debt burden with help from World Bank and IMF. The US will play a role in providing financial support to World Bank and IMF, which in turn will channel the funds to African countries which are facing a debt burden. So this is the goal of Nairobi-Washington Vision. The US is setting aside millions of dollars in funds, almost $250 million, to the International Development Association, or IDA, which is one of the organs of the World Bank. The International Development Association, it provides developmental loans. It's one of the organs of the World Bank. So US is going to fund $250 million specifically for this. And IMF has an initiative called Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. It's an IMF fund to provide assistance to such countries, poor countries which are facing a debt problem. So the US is mobilizing $21 billion in support to the IMF so that through this fund, through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust Fund, the African countries could be assisted to overcome their debt problem, which will reduce their dependency on China. So there is a geopolitical angle behind this. Even though it appears to be an economic initiative, focus is to reduce the debt burden of poor African nations. The true intention of US is to counter the Chinese influence and push China out of Africa. So that is what you need to understand with regard to Nairobi-Washington Vision. So on this note, I bring my discussion to an end. Please take down the practice questions for today. 2 questions based on what we have studied in detail. Use the questions. Remember what we have studied. Go back, watch the session again if you want. Take down the points and try to present your answers in the comment section below. And also don't forget to complete the assignment regarding Char Dham Yatra that I gave you earlier. So I hope the session has been interesting and helpful, and I hope you've understood all the key points that we have discussed. So if you like the session, do let me know in the comments. Don't forget to press the like button and do subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.